Top of the hour here on Coffee and Cream in the morning on Hail Varsity Radio, powered by Currency, live from the H&H Chevrolet stage at Hail Varsity Club. We'll change gears after the opening segment of, I don't know, get to know you.
It was basically how we spent the fourth and why I'm late to the party on the best player in baseball.
Get to know your weekend. But we'll touch base with Brian Christopherson now, senior writer for Husker 24/7 at Husker 24/7 BC on Twitter. BC, good morning.
Good morning, guys. How you doing?
Good, B. But my man AR over here said he went 7 hours on Saturday without touching his phone.
Good.
Given how the month of June went, could Brian Christopherson spend the holiday going 7 hours without looking at his phone?
Probably not, which is pretty sad. That's impressive. That's a goal I should set and everyone should set.
Isn't that something?
Mm-hmm.
Now I can go that long without talking to people, but I would be spending time. Yeah, TikTok recipes. Mm-hmm. I'd be doing something on my phone.
Yeah. Sat on my table.
Yeah. I find that I am looking at my phone even without realizing it a lot, which is not a good place to be. And I think that's how a lot of people are. I'll be sitting on my couch watching something else, but then you bring up your, you flash it in front of you and suddenly you're scrolling Twitter or whatever. And it does become an addiction. And I don't think it's a good thing. You can actually tie this right back to what coaches are trying to fight through, I think, in all levels. I know like Fred Hoiberg, for instance, when they're going on this trip, out of country, one of the things they like about it is the guys can't access their phone as easily. Like they can't get stuff on there. And so you got to spend time talking to your teammate and getting to know your teammate and having face-to-face, looking someone in the eye conversations. And it's really good for those guys. And I know it seems like Rule stresses some of the same sort of stuff when you talk about eating together and, hey, this time's to get to know the person in front of you. Let's leave everything else to the side. So it's not even really a funny side topic anymore, how addicted and reliant we all are on that stuff.
You see, how'd you keep up with the month of June? I mean, that thing was a whirlwind. Quality, quantity, a little bit of both. Where have you kind of rested now that you had a little bit of time to catch your breath on the whirlwind commitments in June? I mean, the Big Ten was busy as a conference.
Yeah, it was a good recruiting month for a lot of people throughout the league. But, I think we just saw, okay, this is going to be how it is around here with this coaching staff. And they said going in, camp season was not going to be light in any ways. There was no vacation time during this part. It was very much about giving guys, even who weren't on the radar, an opportunity in front of them to show, yeah, you're capable of a scholarship. And they honored some of those. And we saw some of those guys even commit pretty quickly. So I guess that was interesting to me, is just it was much more than talk. It was definitely walking the walk as far as these camp sessions are going to mean something. If you're a kid who comes here, there's a chance to get in front of the coaches. And even if you're not a top athlete, we want to coach you up and have it be an experience you remember. And you get feedback across the community and from people who went to that camp say, yeah, that's worth your time. And then hopefully you build off that in the years to come. But obviously from a commitment standpoint, it was nuts. I mean, I think I said this last week when I came back from my vacation, is when I left, in mid-June, they had 9 commitments in the class, and now it's 23, I think is the number. It's just amazing, the amount of just how it grew. And also, I think Daniel Kalen was a story in June. I think the way that he was down here all the time with recruits, one of the best peer recruiting efforts I've seen from a guy who just jumped in the boat a month prior, and the way guys connected to him. And I also think he helped us move the story forward from the Dylan Raiola story. And that's not a knock on Dylan Raiola. He picked where he picked, and that's that. But I think it got people like, I like this Kalen kid, and they're starting talking about him and how he relates to other guys. So I think that was a big thing in June.
BC, do you think there ever could be too much attention given to one geographical area? Take Nebraska's presence in Texas, for example. Like, are they sharing their time well in other states? And don't you want people to say, like, because, when you hear recruits say in Texas, or at least last week we heard coaches in Texas, they're starting to worry about any time a recruit brings up Nebraska. Like, don't you want people across the country saying we worry about Nebraska, not just Texas?
Well, sure you do, but I think that can still happen to a degree. There's only so many places where you can feel like this is basically home turf, though. I mean, it's always going to be a little bit where you're a little bit of the outsider having to fight uphill. That's just the way it is. I mean, when you go into the Northeast, Nebraska, this Husker staff has connections up there. Obviously, Matt Rule's from there. EJ Barthel does a nice job recruiting up there and identifying talent, and they've got a lot of links up there. But I still consider them to be sort of outsiders from Nebraska's location on the map when they try to recruit a prospect there. You got to work hard to get those. Texas is such a rarity in that I don't think I've seen anything quite like it with the guy. When you think about what Rule did at Baylor, he was only, he's there a few years, and to build the trust and the networking he did in that amount of time, and the fact that it still carries over, even though he went to the NFL a few years, and it doesn't seem like those relationships skipped a beat. And so I look at it as just sort of a bonus that they have this Texas area, parts of Texas at least, that are almost like, it feels like regional recruiting ground. Like they can look at it. Yes, you got to get on a plane to get there, but it feels like this is Nebraska and bordering states type recruiting territory for this staff. Like when he goes and speaks to the Texas Coaches Association or whatever he's doing in a couple of weeks, it's not like there's going to be a lot of introductions necessary there to him and certain coaches in the room. He's going to feel like he's, doing something at the embassy down the street. That's just the way he's built that up. So that's a good question, Andrew, but I think people got to look at it differently and just say, Texas, this is unique that they actually have this other state where it is that it feels like it's just home ground, and you're not going to find that very often.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of, and you have to kind of think, BC, maybe give it a year or two in the Northeast could be a thing. I know he's got Evan Taylor from North Carolina, and I don't consider that obviously Northeast, but that's as eastern as he went. Outside of, I think Cook is Maryland, obviously, but he could probably come back to that part of the country. But given Nebraska's recruiting history, BC, last, I don't know, let's go 30 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we could pick a state if Nebraska's going to make some hay. And it's the usual suspects, right? Florida, Texas, California. Don't you think Nebraska fans are most comfortable with Texas?
Yes.
Or am I straight? I'm kind of, your answer to that kind of just made me think. I'm like, now there's been some states they've made some hay for a while over time, and those three come up. Are we the most comfortable with Texas?
Yeah, I think folks are. I mean, you would often hear during the leanest of Nebraska years, well, one of the storylines is they stopped recruiting Texas.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit of a lazy narrative. I do think that there were staffs that still got into Texas. Okay, not to this amount, but they were still recruiting Texas. And I don't believe that's why this thing fell off the ledge. I think it's a lot of the lack of details closer to home, just in your own operation day to day. That's the reason for that. However, you could cast the fact that they didn't quite recruit Texas maybe to the level they have some years as part of it. But I do think it gives people just a warm feeling, like fans around here, like, no, they are serious about high school football there the way people are serious about football here. And I think that gives them comfort.
Yeah, because
I think that's the big
because
reason.
over time it seems like we've soured on California, and I get it, maybe the whole Calibraska thing and guys going back home, and I think similar with Florida, even though we've gotten some big guns from there. Yeah. with guys, so many guys going back home. I just think recency bias has us a little leery of Florida and California.
I think your
At
instinct.
first blush.
Yeah, I think your instincts on that are right, and I'm going to write about this actually at some point this week. If you go back and look at Florida, um, under in the Frost era, they had success getting guys out of there, obviously, but people came and left. They didn't get a lot of anything from those recruits. And so that's why I think people are still a little skittish about Florida. I think they got to open their minds and give the new staff a new shot there and see especially how some of those Miami relationships carry over. Phil Simpson has great respect there. Evan Cooper's from there. So it might be a different story in Florida, but I do sense, because of, you talk about recency bias, the last 5 to 6 years have made probably Husker fans a little like, I don't know, is Florida going to work out? It hasn't in the past. And California, I think, in recruiting in general, has sort of, it's changed since I've been in the business, where right when I started, it was like, yeah, you got to get to California somewhat. And then there was this period where it felt like a lot of coaches across the country were a little lukewarm on it. But now that Tony White is, in the fold here, he's got a lot of relationships, and I do think you're going to see Nebraska open that up. And I'd like to see him get a guy or two out of Hawaii as well. Like, there's just some good players there, and I think that's where you'd hope. Like, Ryla has some connections, and they're after a big 4-star lineman that might decide in a couple of weeks there. A victory like that, I think, would be huge too, to get your foot in the door.
BC, speaking of Florida, Ja'Cory Barney, the most recent Nebraska commit, a big one too, a flip when everybody thought he was Miami through and through, and then all of a sudden he ends up at Nebraska. Just how good of a job has Garrett McGuire done with this recruiting process, with this receiving core, and building something special, and also solidifying his name into conversation of, hey, I belong here? Because I remember at the beginning of this whole thing, it was, Garrett McGuire's pretty young.
Yeah. And that was going to be a story they were going to have to fight through. And I think it's probably easy for him to work through that, because once he gets in the room, and I mean, even if any media who had access to the practices, even for a little bit this spring, even if it was that early portion that some of us got, you're like, man, this guy, he's just so detailed out there. He knows his stuff and inside and out. And you could tell the receivers had a lot of respect for him. So, I think once a recruit or any football player says, this guy knows stuff that can help me, I believe that. That's all that matters. Then you don't care what age he is or where he came from. It's just like, this guy can help me, and that's going to be good enough for me. And I think you saw some tenaciousness on the Ja'Cory Barney recruitment, because, as you said, that was one a few weeks ago. I felt pretty good about Nebraska. And then after he went to Miami on a visit, you're sort of like, yeah, that's home. He was speaking so glowingly of it. Nobody knew exactly where he stood, but it sure felt tilted that way. And I thought that was one of the best recruiting wins of the last month. And the fact that it was Nebraska going head to head with the big boy in a fight where people thought they don't have the inside track, and they just kept punching and punching. And obviously Garrett McGuire's, just the way he would not give up on it, I think was useful. And Evan Cooper too. I mean, Evan Cooper's got his fingertips over a lot of stuff over there. He's so valuable. And that was one of his guys as well. So you always got to give him credit.
I think that it pretty popular consensus, right? That Coop is Coach Rule's right-hand man, like the right-hand man.
I mean, it seems like that to me. And I don't mean that to slight anybody else, but just when you like
I mean everything.
Just across the board.
I mean,
I think that's his go-to. Every coach has their guy on that on a staff. It seems like Rule is Coop's guy.
I don't want to dwell on this, but I mean, sometimes like just when they put out the salaries, like this guy's making this much. I mean, Evan Cooper is the defensive backs coach. I mean, he's well compensated here, and then when you go to a camp, you see him. He is side by side with Rule, and just I think the other coaches, the way they trust his evals, and they believe he really has a gift for it. And I wrote about it last week. James Blanchard is the head recruiting guy at Texas Tech now for Joey McGuire. They're tearing it up, recruiting much the same way Nebraska is. And in this story on this podcast he did last week, Blanchard talks about sort of the things he learned from Rule and Cooper specifically, and just the way he spoke of them and the reverence for the job they do, and how they look for traits in athletes and a projectable recruit, a guy who maybe some people are looking for the reasons why he can't play at the college level. They're looking for, no, these are the 2 or 3 reasons why he can, and we're going to accentuate those when he gets here and he's going to succeed. I think you see a lot of that in Evan Cooper's evaluations.
I speak to that firsthand. BC, with legitimately firsthand. So with SC and UCLA coming, my guy Thomas asked me, do you think that's the next state that naturally comes into the fray in the recruiting landscape? Or do you think he stays more regional with some of the influence he wants to have in the Kansas City, in the state of Missouri? Which state do you kind of see becoming next? Is it someplace in the Northeast after a year that I alluded to earlier? Or is it natural with White and SC and UCLA that it could be Cali?
Cali's in the running. I mean, I think it's going to be Nebraska, Texas, always in your 1-2 spots, maybe even Texas. Texas right now, there's 7 commits from there, 6 from Nebraska. I think Florida could be tough to beat as like that 3rd state just because of some of those Southern Florida connections. But I think California definitely could rise up and be like right in that category. I guess that's right after Nebraska and Texas. I think you're right on that, because I do think Tony White was such an exceptional recruiter, and people have been sort of wired in on just like his scheme and all that stuff. But just go back and look at the time he spent coaching out there. And I mean, he was regarded as one of the best recruiters in that region for years. And so, those connections didn't go away. He's really tied into some of the top programs in the country. He's tied into programs where there might be a player who's like 2nd team on the depth chart at one of those powerhouse programs in California right now, but he knows about them, and Nebraska is going to have a shot at a guy who's maybe under the radar, but is going to be a really good recruit. I think that's why that's a state that could rise up. And I think the Kansas City area too is another spot you hope that the staff can get into more. And I think Rob Dvorak and guys like Keith Williams are doing a good job trying to make that a reality. And
it seems like Keith does a lot of the little behind the scenes dirty recruiting work. You know what I mean? Like, he kind of gets overlooked a little bit, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, just probably because he's not a full-time assistant, but he's one of those guys who's, what's my job? I do my job. And I think there's a lot of guys like that over there. Rule and the staff went to speak at the convention in Kansas City and get to know people there. And I think they're very serious and intentional about making that region something that pops again. Can Nebraska get into St. Louis at least a little bit? That's still it's been like the Bermuda Triangle for the Huskers. I mean, that's one where we'll see. But if they can unlock that one and get like even just a class who's kind of special out of St. Louis, and he starts to take off here, that could be a big deal too.
I'll give my people a call.
Dude, it's kind of a tight-knit football community too. A lot of those coaches, Carl Reed, a lot of these guys over at they seem to kind of all help, they cross promote for the region. So you're right. Maybe there is a Pied Piper or two in that area.
Yeah. It's just an interesting staff. We're talking about all these spots. I mean, last cycle, Nashville, Tennessee popped up. I mean, they got some of the guys people won't recognize as being from there, but they are, like Sincere Safula. I don't say his last name correctly. You know what I'm talking about. Sincere, he's from the Nashville area. Jacob Hood was from the Nashville area. Demetrius Bell. And I just bring those guys up as like that's where the staff's really intriguing. Like, suddenly you think you got like them pegged for this spot and that spot, And then you realize like, oh, they've gotten 2 guys out of here recently. They have some connections there. So they really are taking advantage of all the links they have.
BC, before, well, I guess this last one for me, you just finished up your indispensable list. It all ended with QB1 as number 1. Sims has the physical traits to be successful, but right now it seems like a whole bunch of belief that he'll be successful in every other category away from the physical side. Does it not?
Yeah, I mean, this staff had a lot of research on him before they brought him in. Rule had watched him play all the time at Georgia Tech. He got as good insight as you can from Jeff Collins, who's a friend, I think, in the coaching game to him. And back in December, of course, there was those quotes at early signing day where you could just tell, like, there was just full belief, like, this guy has the stuff. We just got to bring it out of him. And the reason you think you can is what, as Marcus Satterfield has said in multiple interviews, he's just a really smart, like, football junkie guy. So when you have one of those guys who just wants to find every way to get better, and it seems like Jeff Sims is that way from what we hear, as was Casey Thompson, I feel.
Oh, yeah.
You got a fighting chance. I thought, like, even though it was limited time in the spring game, for his one audition in front of the fan base, thought he played pretty well. Like, I thought he handled that moment well, and I thought he handled the interviews in a manner that makes you think like he can be that guy who steps forward to the mic every week, and stuff, and doesn't get overly worked up about it, and can communicate what he needs to and and not say what he shouldn't say too, which is a big part of that job. So I think there's a lot of tools that are in the kit. It's just a matter if he can reach for them here and get them in his hand.
BC, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much. We'll talk again next week.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, B.
Brian Christopherson, senior writer for Husker 24/7 at Husker 24/7 BC on Twitter. We'll talk to Andy Kendi up next. We'll get a little more into recruiting. I want to ask him, did you watch well, I guess I did. We did talk about this a little bit when Matt Waldron got called up last week, West Side kid, for the Padres, and then he got sent back down, and then he got called back up yesterday. And, I almost want to know, you played at the highest level, so you kind of get it. Like being on a taxi squad.
It's hard. It's hard.
Like,
as a guy
when
that
you're getting
was always,
led on, and
as
then
a guy that
not.
always had to fight for roster spots, it does something to you. You have to be prepared to be suitcase to suitcase. And
is it harder in baseball than
no?
anything?
I think it's actually easier because you're not really changing multiple teams. It's the same organization, so I think you're okay with that. I think
interesting.
That's just me.
Yeah, because I was talking to my buddy yesterday, and I'm like, man, what's he thinking about? Because he's like intertwined with him. His girlfriend's sister dates him, and I'm like, he's like, oh man, it sucks.
It's tough. I get it.
I wonder if Kendi can answer it. Yeah, we'll be back.